the night I came home early and caught my husband's best friend robbing our safe. I was ready to call the police until he told me why he was stealing from us. What he revealed about my husband made me realize that the man I'd been married to for 25 years was a complete stranger. Some secrets are so dark, they change everything you thought you knew about your life. Before I tell you about that night, I need to tell you about my husband, Daniel, and his best friend, Paul, because understanding their friendship is crucial to understanding how everything unraveled. Daniel and Paul had been friends since they were 7 years old. They grew up next door to each other in a small town about an hour from where we eventually settled. They were inseparable as children, went to the same schools, played on the same sports teams, got in trouble together, graduated together. When I met Daniel in nursing school, he was there getting his degree in hospital administration. Paul was his roommate. The three of us spent countless evenings together, and Paul was there when Daniel proposed to me. He was the best man at our wedding. He was godfather to our first child. Paul was family, as much a part of our lives as any blood relative. When he got married to his wife Sandra, Daniel returned the favor and stood up as his best man. Our families vacationed together. Our children grew up together. We celebrated holidays and birthdays and milestones side by side for decades. Paul was a contractor, ran his own construction business. Daniel worked his way up to becoming chief operating officer at one of the major hospitals in our city. Both men were successful, respected, pillars of the community. They played golf every Saturday morning, had been doing so for 20 years. They had inside jokes that went back to childhood. They finished each other's sentences. If you'd asked me to name the person Daniel trusted most in the world besides me, it would have been Paul without question. That's why what happened was so devastating, because it wasn't just about catching someone stealing. It was about discovering that everything I thought I knew about my life was built on lies. Let me take you back to how it all started unfolding. Daniel and I had been married for 25 years. We had 3 children: Marcus, who you've heard about in my other stories, Trevor, and our daughter Simone, who was the baby of the family. Our marriage wasn't perfect, whose is? But it was solid. We'd weathered the usual storms, financial struggles in the early years, the stress of raising 3 children, the grief of losing Daniel's mother to cancer, the challenges of maintaining romance while juggling careers and kids. But we'd made it work. We communicated. We compromised. We laughed together. We'd built a life that looked good and felt good. Or so I thought. About 6 months before the night everything fell apart, I started noticing small things. Daniel seemed distracted, distant. He'd be in the middle of a conversation with me and suddenly zone out, like his mind had gone somewhere else entirely. He started working late more often, coming home at 8 or 9 at night when he used to be home by 6. He said it was stress at work. The hospital was going through some administrative changes, budget cuts, personnel issues. He said his job was on the line and he needed to prove himself indispensable. I believed him because, why wouldn't I? Daniel had always been a hard worker, always dedicated to his career. It made sense that during a difficult time at work, he'd be putting in extra hours. But there were other things too. He became protective of his phone in a way he'd never been before. He'd take it with him everywhere, to the bathroom, out to the garage, even just moving from the living room to the kitchen. If it rang when I was nearby, he'd walk away to answer it. When I mentioned this, he said he was dealing with sensitive work issues and needed privacy for some calls. Again, it seemed reasonable. He started taking more business trips, weekend conferences he needed to attend, training seminars in other cities, site visits to hospitals in other states that were implementing systems he needed to learn about. In 25 years of marriage, Daniel had maybe taken 10 business trips. In those 6 months, he took 8. I felt something shifting between us, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. We were still affectionate with each other. We still had dinner together most nights, still talked about our days, still made love occasionally, though less frequently than before. It felt like he was slowly fading away, becoming translucent, like I could look right at him but not quite see him clearly anymore. I talked to Paul's wife Sandra about it one day over coffee. I asked her if Paul had mentioned anything about work being stressful or Daniel seeming different. Sandra said Paul hadn't mentioned anything specific, but that men sometimes went through phases where they pulled back emotionally. She said her therapist had told her it was a middle-age thing, that Daniel was probably processing getting older and evaluating his life. That made sense to me. Daniel had just turned 52. Maybe he was having some kind of midlife crisis. Maybe he needed space to work through whatever he was feeling. So I gave him space. I stopped asking so many questions. I stopped pushing for connection when he seemed withdrawn. I told myself this was temporary, that we'd get through it like we'd gotten through everything else. Then came the financial irregularities. I handled most of our personal finances, paid the bills, balanced the checkbooks, managed our investments. Daniel earned more than I did, but I was better with numbers and organization, so this division of labor had always worked for us. I noticed that our joint savings account balance was lower than I expected. Not dramatically lower, but about $5,000 less than my records indicated it should be. I checked the transaction history and saw a withdrawal that I didn't remember making. The notation just said cash withdrawal with a date and an ATM location. I asked Daniel about it. He said he'd needed cash for something and had forgotten to mention it. When I asked what he'd needed $5,000 in cash for, he got irritated and said he didn't need to account for every dollar he spent. He reminded me that it was his money from his salary and he was entitled to access it when he needed to. That response bothered me. We'd never had that kind of attitude about money. It was our money, not his money or my money. We made financial decisions together. But I let it go because I didn't want to fight about it. 2 weeks later, another withdrawal. This time $3,000. Then another one the following month. $4,000. When I brought it up again, Daniel became defensive. He said he was dealing with some expenses related to work that he'd be reimbursed for later. He said I was being controlling and paranoid, that he'd never questioned how I spent money, and he didn't appreciate being interrogated. This wasn't like Daniel at all. We'd been together for 25 years, and he'd never spoken to me that way, never been secretive about money. Never made me feel like I was being unreasonable for asking basic questions about our finances. I started to wonder if there was another woman. The classic signs were there: the distance, the secrecy, the unexplained money withdrawals, the business trips. It would explain everything. The thought made me sick to my stomach. I didn't want to believe Daniel would cheat on me, but I couldn't ignore the evidence that something was very wrong. I did something I'm not proud of. I checked Daniel's credit card statements online. I found charges to restaurants in cities where he'd supposedly been on business trips. Nothing concrete, just dinners that could have been business meals or could have been romantic dinners with someone else. I found charges to hotels that weren't the ones he'd told me he was staying at during his trips. I found a charge to a jewelry store for $1,500. I never received any jewelry. When I casually mentioned our anniversary coming up, Daniel said we should do something low-key because money was tight. But apparently money wasn't too tight for him to spend $1,500 on jewelry for someone. I felt like I was losing my mind. Every explanation I came up with seemed both possible and impossible at the same time. Was he having an affair? Was he in some kind of financial trouble he wasn't telling me about? Was there a gambling problem I didn't know about? I thought about hiring a private investigator, but that felt like such a betrayal. How do you come back from that level of distrust? I thought about confronting Daniel directly, demanding the truth, but part of me was terrified of what the truth might be. So I did nothing. I watched and worried and waited for something to break. Then came the night that changed everything. I was supposed to be at a nursing conference 2 hours away, an overnight event that happened annually. Daniel knew I'd be gone from Thursday afternoon until Friday evening. I'd told him several weeks in advance, had it marked on the calendar. But on Thursday morning, I woke up with the worst migraine I'd had in years, the kind of headache that makes light painful and nausea inevitable. I knew I couldn't drive 2 hours and sit through conference sessions. I needed to be in a dark room with medication. I called the conference organizers and canceled. I called Daniel at work to let him know I'd be home, but his phone went to voicemail. I left a message, took my medication, and went back to bed with the curtains drawn. I slept most of the day, that heavy, deep sleep that comes with migraine medication. When I finally woke up, it was 8 o'clock at night. My head felt better, but I was disoriented and groggy. The house was quiet, dark. Daniel's car wasn't in the driveway. I assumed he was working late again, or maybe out with Paul since he thought I was gone for the night. I made myself some tea and toast, the first food I'd had all day, and sat in the kitchen trying to fully wake up. That's when I heard a sound from upstairs, a thump, like something being dropped. My first thought was that Daniel had come home and I hadn't heard him, but his car wasn't outside. Maybe he'd parked in the garage? I called out his name. No answer. Another sound. This time I could tell it was coming from our bedroom. Honey! My heart started pounding. Someone was in our house. I should have called 911 right then. That's what any sensible person would have done. But I was still fuzzy from the medication and not thinking entirely clearly. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen. I don't know what I thought I'd do with it, and quietly went upstairs. Our bedroom door was open. The light was on. I could see shadows moving. I crept closer, my hands shaking, the knife feeling ridiculous and inadequate. When I reached the doorway, I looked inside. Paul was kneeling in front of our safe, which was open. He was pulling out cash stacks of $100 bills that we kept for emergencies. He had a small duffel bag next to him and was stuffing the money inside. I stood there frozen for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. This was Paul, Daniel's best friend, our children's godfather, a man who'd been at our dinner table 1,000 times, and he was robbing us. I must have made a sound, a gasp or something, because Paul turned around. When he saw me, the look on his face was pure panic, then resignation, like he'd been caught doing something he knew was inevitable but had hoped to avoid. He stood up slowly, the duffel bag in his hand. He didn't run, didn't try to explain, just stood there looking at me with this expression that was part shame, part defiance. I finally found my voice and asked him what he thought he was doing. He said exactly what I could see. He was taking the money from our safe. My mind was racing. I asked him if he needed money that badly, if he was in some kind of trouble. I said I couldn't believe he'd break into our house and steal from us instead of just asking for help. Paul laughed then, but it was a bitter sound. He said I had it all wrong. He said he wasn't stealing. He was taking what was owed to him. I didn't understand. I asked what he meant, what we possibly could owe him. That's when Paul told me to sit down, that there were things I needed to know about Daniel. Things Paul had kept secret for 2 years because Daniel was his best friend and because he'd believed Daniel's promises that he'd make things right. But Daniel hadn't made things right. Daniel had used Paul, lied to Paul, destroyed Paul's business and marriage, and left Paul with no choice but to take back what Daniel had taken from him. I sat down on the edge of our bed, still holding that ridiculous knife, and Paul told me everything. 2 years earlier, Daniel had come to Paul with an investment opportunity. He said he'd met someone through his hospital work, a developer who was putting together a medical office complex. The developer needed investors, and Daniel said it was a guaranteed return. The healthcare market was booming, the location was perfect, and the developer had a track record of successful projects. Daniel said he was investing $50,000 of his own money. He suggested Paul do the same. He said in 2 years they'd triple their investment. Paul trusted Daniel completely. They'd been best friends for 45 years. If Daniel said something was a good investment, Paul believed him. Paul liquidated some of his retirement savings and gave Daniel $50,000 to invest in the medical office complex. A year went by. Paul would ask Daniel how the investment was going, and Daniel would say it was progressing well, that there had been some delays with permits and zoning but nothing to worry about. He'd show Paul occasional updates, emails from the supposed developer, documents about the project, reassurances that their money was working for them. Another 6 months went by. Paul started asking more questions. When could he expect to see returns? Could he visit the construction site? Could he meet the developer? Daniel always had reasons why none of that was possible yet. The developer was very private. The construction site wasn't ready for visitors. Returns wouldn't come until the project was complete and the office spaces were leased. Then Paul's construction business hit some rough patches. Several contracts fell through. Some clients didn't pay on time. Cash flow became a problem. Paul needed money, his own money that he'd invested with Daniel. He asked Daniel if he could withdraw his investment, even if it meant losing some of the projected returns. He just needed his $50,000 back. Daniel said that would be difficult. The money was tied up in the project. There would be penalties for early withdrawal. He asked Paul to wait just a few more months, and he'd have his money, plus the returns they'd been promised. Paul waited. His business continued to struggle. He had to let employees go. He had to turn down contracts he didn't have the capital to take on. His marriage started suffering because of the financial stress. Paul went to Daniel again, more urgently this time. He said he needed his money back immediately, that his business was going under without it. He said he didn't care about penalties or lost returns. He needed his $50,000 to save everything he'd built. Daniel admitted then that there was a problem. The developer had disappeared. The project had never been real. The money was gone. Paul was devastated. He asked Daniel how he could have let this happen, why he hadn't done more due diligence, whether they could go to the police or hire lawyers to track down this developer and recover their money. Daniel said he'd already tried everything. The developer's identity had been fake. The documents had been forged. They'd been victims of a sophisticated con, and the money was unrecoverable. Paul asked if Daniel had lost his $50,000 too. Daniel said yes, that he was just as much a victim as Paul was. Paul's business failed within 3 months. 20 years of building a successful construction company gone because he'd trusted his best friend with his money. His marriage fell apart 6 months after that. Sandra couldn't forgive Paul for losing their retirement savings. She said he'd been reckless and stupid to invest such a large sum without consulting her or doing proper research. The financial stress and resentment destroyed what they'd built together. They were now separated and heading toward divorce. Paul had lost everything: his business, his marriage, his financial security, his future. And through all of it, Daniel had been supportive and sympathetic. He'd told Paul how sorry he was, how guilty he felt, how he wished he could help, but he'd lost his own money in the scam too. Then, 3 months ago, Paul had been at our house for a barbecue. He'd gone inside to use the bathroom and walked past Daniel's home office. The door was open, and Paul happened to glance inside. On Daniel's desk was a bank statement. Paul wouldn't normally have looked at it, wouldn't have invaded Daniel's privacy that way, but something about the account name caught his eye. It was an account Paul didn't recognize, not our joint accounts, not Daniel's business accounts, a separate account at a bank we didn't normally use. Paul told himself to mind his own business and walk away. But something made him look closer. He saw the balance over $200,000. He saw recent deposits and withdrawals. And he saw something that made his blood run cold. A deposit from 2 years ago, $100,000, right around the time Paul had given Daniel his $50,000 to invest. Paul started investigating. He didn't have full access to Daniel's records, but he had enough information to start piecing things together. He discovered that Daniel had never invested any money in any medical office complex. There had been no developer, no project, no scam. Daniel had simply taken Paul's $50,000 and kept it. Paul confronted Daniel privately. Daniel denied everything at first, said Paul must have misunderstood what he saw. When Paul pressed harder, said he had proof and was going to go to the police, Daniel finally admitted the truth. There had been no investment opportunity. Daniel had needed money desperately for what he wouldn't say, and he'd created an elaborate lie to get it from Paul. He'd forged documents, sent fake emails from burner accounts, maintained the fiction for 2 years. He said he'd always planned to pay Paul back. He said things had been complicated, but he was working on it. He begged Paul not to go to the police, said it would destroy his career, his reputation, his family. Daniel promised that if Paul gave him just a little more time, he'd pay back everything with interest. He said he had money in investments that he could liquidate, that Paul would get his $50,000 back plus another $25,000 for his trouble. Paul wanted to believe him. Despite everything, he wanted to believe his best friend wasn't a complete monster, so he agreed to wait 1 more month. 1 month became 2, then 3. Daniel always had excuses. The investments couldn't be liquidated yet without huge penalties. There were tax implications he needed to work around. He was waiting on a bonus from work. Meanwhile, Paul's financial situation was desperate. He'd lost his house to foreclosure. He was living in a cheap apartment. He was working odd jobs just to pay for food and basic expenses. He'd gone from successful business owner to broke and homeless because Daniel had stolen from him and then lied about it for 2 years. Paul said he'd finally realized Daniel was never going to pay him back, that all the promises were just more lies to buy time, that Daniel had sacrificed his best friend to save himself from whatever problem he'd needed that money for. So Paul had decided to take back what was his. He knew Daniel and I kept emergency cash in our safe. He knew where the safe was and how to open it because years ago, when we'd asked him to check on our house while we were on vacation, Daniel had told him the combination in case of emergency. Paul said he didn't want to hurt me. He knew I probably didn't know about any of this, that Daniel had kept me in the dark. But he needed that money. It was his money. Daniel had stolen it, and Paul was just taking back what belonged to him. I sat there on my bed, listening to this story, and I felt like the floor was dropping out from under me. My husband had stolen $50,000 from his best friend, had lied about it for 2 years, had destroyed Paul's entire life and felt so little remorse that he'd let Paul lose everything rather than admit the truth and face consequences. I asked Paul why Daniel had needed the money in the first place. What could possibly have been so important that he'd betray his best friend this way? Paul said he didn't know. Daniel had never told him, and Paul had never figured it out. All he knew was that Daniel had been desperate enough to commit fraud and destroy a 45-year friendship. I looked at Paul, this man who'd been like a brother to my husband, like family to me, godfather to my children, and I saw what my husband had reduced him to. Broke, desperate, reduced to breaking into homes and stealing cash like a common criminal. I told Paul to take the money. All of it. Everything in the safe. Paul looked shocked. He said he'd only intended to take $50,000, what Daniel owed him. There was almost $80,000 in the safe. I told him to take all of it. I said it was the least Daniel owed him, and that I'd make sure Daniel didn't report it or come after him for it. I said Paul deserved restitution not just for the money but for the business, the marriage, the life that Daniel had destroyed. Paul started crying then. He said he'd been so angry for so long, but hearing me believe him, having someone validate what had happened to him, it just broke something open inside him. I hugged this man who'd been robbing my safe, and we both cried for the wreckage Daniel had left behind. After Paul left with the money, I sat in my bedroom for hours, trying to understand who my husband really was. The man I'd thought I was married to would never have done what Paul described. That man was honest, loyal, principled. That man valued relationships over money. That man would have worked 3 jobs before betraying his best friend. But apparently that man didn't exist. Or maybe he had existed once and had changed into someone I didn't recognize. I thought about the money withdrawals from our savings account, the mysterious business trips, the jewelry I'd never seen. I thought about how Daniel had been distant and secretive for months. Where had all that money gone? What was he paying for? What secret was so expensive that he'd stolen from his best friend to fund it? I considered confronting Daniel that night, but I wasn't ready. I needed time to think, to process, to decide what I was going to do with this information. I put everything back in order in our bedroom. I closed the safe, now nearly empty. I went back downstairs and waited. Daniel came home around 11. He seemed surprised to see me, said he thought I was at my conference. I told him I'd come home sick with a migraine. He was immediately solicitous, asking if I was feeling better, if I needed anything, playing the role of concerned husband while hiding the fact that he was a thief and a liar. I told him I was fine and went up to bed. Over the next week, I did my own investigating. I went through every financial record I could find. I found the secret account Paul had mentioned. Daniel had been careful, but not careful enough. I found records of money transfers, investments, purchases. And I found something else, something that explained everything and nothing at the same time. Daniel had a daughter, a 14-year-old girl named Claire who lived 2 states away with her mother, Jennifer. Yes, honey, the same Jennifer who was Marcus's girlfriend, the one who cheated on him, though this was years before that happened, back when they were all in college together. Apparently, Daniel and Jennifer had had an affair while he was in graduate school, and I was working crazy hours as a new nurse. Jennifer had gotten pregnant. Daniel had panicked and paid for her to go away, to raise the baby in another state, to keep the whole thing secret. For 14 years, he'd been sending Jennifer money every month, thousands of dollars for child support, thousands more for private school tuition. Money for summer camps and music lessons and everything a middle-class child needs. Then, 2 years ago, Jennifer had gotten sick. Cancer. She'd needed treatment that her insurance didn't fully cover. She'd asked Daniel for more money. A lot more money. Daniel had paid for her chemotherapy, her medications, her medical bills. He'd depleted his savings. Then he'd stolen from Paul to keep funding Jennifer's treatment. Jennifer had survived. She was in remission now. But the cost had been astronomical. I found cards and letters from Claire in a locked box in Daniel's office. A daughter calling him Daddy, telling him about her life, asking when she could meet his family. Daniel had been living a double life for 14 years, and I'd never suspected a thing. I sat with this information for 3 days. Then I called a lawyer. When I confronted Daniel with what I knew, he broke down completely. He admitted everything: the affair with Jennifer, the secret daughter, the financial support he'd been providing, the theft from Paul, all of it. He said he'd made a terrible mistake all those years ago, but he couldn't abandon his daughter. He said he'd planned to tell me about her eventually, but the longer he kept the secret, the harder it became to reveal the truth. He said he'd taken the money from Paul because he was desperate and didn't know what else to do. He said he'd always planned to pay him back, that he hadn't meant for things to spiral the way they had. He begged me to forgive him. He said he loved me, that our marriage was real even if he'd been keeping this massive secret. He said we could work through this. I told him I wanted a divorce. The fallout was extensive. I told Paul's wife Sandra what had really happened to their money. She and Paul reconciled once she understood that Paul hadn't been reckless or stupid. He'd been betrayed by someone he trusted completely. I made sure Paul got his money back, with interest, from the divorce settlement. Daniel had no choice but to pay up since the alternative was criminal charges for fraud. I met Claire once, after the divorce. She was a sweet girl who looked like Daniel but had Jennifer's mannerisms. She didn't understand why her father's family was falling apart. I felt sorry for her, but I couldn't be part of Daniel's other life. My children struggled with the revelation that they had a half-sister, Marcus especially, given his history with Jennifer. The whole situation was messy and painful and damaged relationships that might never fully heal. Daniel lost his job at the hospital when the board learned about the fraud against Paul. His reputation was destroyed. He moved to be closer to Claire and Jennifer, starting over in a new city where people didn't know his story. As for me, I walked away from 25 years of marriage with the understanding that you can sleep next to someone every night and still not know who they really are. The lessons from this story are hard ones, honey. First, trust has to be earned and maintained. Daniel had built up trust over decades, then violated it in ways that could never be repaired. Second, secrets have a way of becoming more expensive over time. That affair and secret daughter cost Daniel his marriage, his friendship, his career, and his reputation. Third, desperate people do desperate things. Daniel should have confessed and faced consequences years ago. Instead, he compounded his mistakes until the whole house of cards collapsed. And finally, sometimes the person who seems most trustworthy is the one hiding the biggest secrets. I think about that night sometimes, catching Paul in front of our safe. If I hadn't come home early with that migraine, I might never have learned the truth. I might have lived the rest of my life not knowing about Claire, about the theft, about who Daniel really was. In a strange way, Paul robbing our safe was a gift. It revealed the truth and set me free. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more true stories about betrayal, hidden secrets, and the strength it takes to rebuild after your world falls apart. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely was living a double life? Have you experienced financial fraud from a friend or family member, or learned that your spouse had been keeping life-changing secrets from you for years? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories matter, and this community is here to support each other through these devastating betrayals. Remember, if something feels off in your relationship, if there are unexplained money withdrawals, secretive behavior, or a growing emotional distance, trust your instincts and don't be afraid to seek the truth. Sometimes the people closest to us are hiding the biggest secrets, and discovering the truth, as painful as it is, can be the first step toward freedom and healing. And if someone you care about is being financially exploited or defrauded, even by a trusted friend, help them seek justice. They deserve restitution and accountability. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.